Chris knows exactly what I'm talking about. That is right. We're talking about inflation, the supply chain, and how this is going to affect you on episode 318 of the In the Tank podcast. Cue music. Late on the... Donnie is far more aggressive when no one can see him. Yes, for those of you that are watching us live, you'll just see a little picture of me with a ring that expands when I'm talking because it's either that I'm having an internet issue and a limited bandwidth, or I'm hiding a black eye or an acne breakout. You decide. We'll figure that one out along on this episode of the In the Tank podcast. As always, I'm your host, Donald Kendal. And joining me, and you could actually see their beautiful shining faces, I've got Justin Haskins, editorial director at the Heartland Institute, co-head of the Stopping Socialism Project, and co-author of the upcoming book, The Great Reset. How are you doing today, good sir?
There's too many co's in my title.
I know, I was going to point that out.
Too many co's. It makes me sound like I'm dependent on other people. I don't like it. We gotta straighten this out.
Yeah, we gotta straighten this out. Also joining us, Chris Talgo, senior editor of at the Heartland Institute. How are you, good sir?
Doing good, Donnie.
This is actually a live picture of me. I'm just really good at not moving my lips when I talk. So just like opening chit chat, we're getting to the holiday season. It's basically holiday season, in my opinion. We're in holiday mode. Halloween rolls into Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving rolls into Christmas. What are your views on Thanksgiving? Because we used to have a co-host on the show. I won't name him, but he despised Thanksgiving. He said it was an overrated holiday, and he said that the food was subpar. Do you guys agree or disagree?
What? Who is this?
John Noderf.
Who's that?
Windex salesman.
John Noderf. Oh, Windex guy. Got it. Totally forgot about him. Yeah, I mean, John's an idiot, which is why he isn't here anymore, and now sold the big Windex. Thanksgiving is obviously an amazing holiday. I don't know why anyone would be opposed to it. I think it's actually one of those holidays where, I actually know people who like it better than Christmas. It is a little bit...
That's crazy.
Well, I mean, I love Christmas, but I do understand that at least with Thanksgiving, it's like the consumerism of Christmas is usually, kind of pushed aside, and it's just kind of a family holiday. Like why would John hate a family holiday? I don't understand that. That's basically all it is a family holiday where we all get together and we think about things that we're thankful for. I mean, what is the hate about that? I don't really understand that. I mean, I guess you could not like the food, okay, fine.
Right.
But, you can eat anything you want. There's no rules. You can do anything you want.
Chris is the most wholesome person probably on the podcast and maybe even in the organization. So I assume your answer is that you love everything that Thanksgiving stands for.
I actually do love Thanksgiving, and I think I might like it more than Christmas, and here's why. First of all, I love watching football the whole day. That is just so much fun. Family comes over. I haven't seen them, probably for a very long time. But also, I like Thanksgiving because it like kicks off the Christmas season for me. So I like the anticipation of looking forward to Christmas Day, it's fun and everything, but then afterwards I kind of, think it's a little bit of a bummer. So
I see that. I like that. That makes sense.
I don't see either of you guys standing in line on Black Friday waiting for a big electronic TV or anything like that, but
I have done that.
Have you?
I actually have. I have done
Justin's
that
one of the people
times.
Trampling over other people, storming in through the door so you can get a toaster at half price.
That's the reason I like Thanksgiving. We didn't get to that part yet, but it's the blood sport that is. Although this year, which is it's a very topical transition that you're doing here, I think. I mean, this year it's going to be there's probably going to be more blood in the streets this year for people trying to buy a good deal on Black Friday, given how costly everything is becoming.
Boom. All right. You made the transition for me. Yeah. So today I wanted to talk about inflation. There's been a lot of stories about inflation over the past several months. We've discussed it a little bit here and there, but I thought it was time to dedicate an entire episode to the concept of inflation. So this is one of those subjects that I think can be a little dry. Conservatives and libertarians have been seemingly warning about the potential of inflation for years, if not decades. It's also one of those subjects that's mostly discussed from like an economic or academic perspective. But I think treating it that way does a disservice to the concept, because it's not just some economic jargon. It's not just some arbitrary monetary target set by central banks. No. Inflation is, at its heart, a hidden tax on everybody in the country. Worse yet, it's a highly regressive tax that affects the middle and lower class disproportionately. And when the government spends money haphazardly, pursues not modern monetary policy, just monetary policy of easy money, and runs the printing presses like there's no tomorrow, there are consequences. Boom, there's me. And governments that are too afraid to tax its populations to pay for spending out of fear of expending political capital, they tax us underhandedly through inflation. So this is the most underhanded way to tax us, inflation. It's not necessarily intentional. In fact, like theoretically, it could be completely unintentional if you just have incompetent public, representatives, right? But it's the inevitable result of policies that are in place. So when the value of the dollar is eroded, your purchasing power is eroded. So you might have gotten a 5% raise last year, but if the cost of everything goes up 10%, everything's 10% more expensive, you've essentially received a pay cut. And what's causing that 10% increase in everything? Well, the policies that are in place by the government. So this is why we call it a hidden tax. They didn't pass a bill that raised your taxes. However, it was the government's policies that resulted in you having fewer real dollars at the end of the day. Chris, is there anything that you want to correct or clarify about what I just said?
No, I mean, to me, it's, inflation is pretty simple. When the government prints trillions of dollars like they have since, the COVID-19 pandemic, I think they've printed now 4.7 trillion, just dumped it into the economy. You've got more dollars chasing fewer goods and services, because also during the COVID-19 pandemic, we did this thing called an economic shutdown. So we, closed businesses, which actually stifled production of goods, and then obviously services couldn't be offered. So you've got like a double whammy going on now. You've got the government just pouring in trillions of dollars, and you've got less goods and services available. So obviously you're going to have hyperinflation at some point.
Justin, anything to add to that, especially on the concept of inflation being like a hidden tax?
I think one of the most important things to keep in mind when we're talking about inflation is that it's not just a hidden tax, but it's a hidden tax that builds over time, right? And so some of that inflation is going to is sort of a natural part of a growing economy. It's going to happen naturally over time, and some inflation is actually good, a lot of economists believe. But when you have...
I disagree, but go ahead.
When you have lots of inflation happening quickly, it's not good. And when you have that happen over a couple of years, it actually builds on top of each other, right? The rate might actually go down next year, for example. We might have an inflation of 2% next year, but that does not change the fact that prices have gone up, 5% or 6% this year, right? So it's a tax that continues to build over time. It's cumulative. And unless you have wages and wealth growing at a comparable rate, you're progressively getting poorer as this is going on. And so you need to have wages keep up with inflation in order for this to work. The other thing that you want to pay close attention to is, are people working? It's not just what wages, but it's hours worked too, right? So when you have more part-time employees in an economy, And that means people are working relative to previous periods of time, which is exactly the situation we have now. You have people actually working fewer hours than they were working before. Even if their wages are going up, they're actually making less money, and yet everything is more expensive. So they're actually much poorer than they were before. So if you had a full-time job before and now you have a part-time job and you have inflation on top of it, you're in a significantly worse situation than you were just a couple years ago. And there are lots and lots of people, hundreds of thousands, perhaps even millions of people who are in that situation right now. So the big thing is, yes, it's a hidden tax, but it is a cumulative tax that builds over time relative to the wage growth that you have.
So just a couple of comments that we got here. OMG, I stayed till 1:30 a.m. Singapore for a gym rant, and he's not on. Followed by TM Willemsa says he's probably on his way to Scotland. That is correct. He is on his way to Scotland. Just another comment. Someone looking for Andy's Climate Realism channel. Obviously, that is just Andy, our producer, that put a fake name, and he's leaving comments to try to plug his own videos. So that's Climate Realism. You can just look it up on YouTube, Andy. So, yeah. But yes, all very...
Donnie, just one thing, Justin makes a really good point, and inflation does beget more inflation. And there's also a psychological factor at play, because if consumers think that prices are going to, be rising later down the road, they're going to start buying, more products in the here and now, which is going to lead to more inflation.
Right. No, I mean, these all very solid points, and we've discussed inflation on this podcast before, but it always comes off as this theoretical problem that might arise if we pursue policies A, B, and C. Inflation is always treated as this like boogeyman that's hiding underneath the bed. If we act recklessly with our public policy and monetary policy, it's going to come out from underneath the bed. And like even today, when we are seeing inflation manifesting, it is either largely ignored or discounted as a short-term problem. So apart from gas prices, I think this next story might be a message that resonates with people, alerting them to the idea that maybe that boogeyman that we've been warning about is actually now crawling out from underneath the bed. So this is a New York Times piece. It's titled, "This Year's Thanksgiving Feast Will Wallop the Wallet." So it starts off saying Thanksgiving 2021 could be the most expensive meal in the history of the holiday. Nearly every component of the traditional American Thanksgiving dinner, from the disposable aluminum turkey roasting pan to the coffee and pie, will cost more this year, according to the agricultural economists, farmers, and grocery executives. Major food companies like Nestle and Procter & Gamble have already warned consumers to brace for more price increases. It says there is no single culprit. The nation's food supply has been battered by a knotted supply chain, high transportation expenses, labor shortages, trade policies, and bad weather. Inflation is at play too. In September, the consumer price index for food was up 4.6% from last year. Prices of meat, poultry, fish, and eggs soared 10.5%. So, like I said, this is something that, you don't have to get into historical precedent or the 3% target rate of the Fed or any historical stuff when it comes to inflation. You could go and talk to your friends and family, maybe over Thanksgiving and say like, hey, did you realize that this is like the most expensive this meal has ever been? And you can thank inflation. What do you think about that, Chris?
Well, first of all, let's also take into account that people are going to be traveling for Thanksgiving, and air flights are much more expensive. Gasoline's obviously much more expensive. So it's not just going to be the dinner table. It's going to be literally getting to the dinner table. That's going to cost people a lot more money. And I think that we should not discount the Biden energy policies and the role that they have played in this, because fossil fuels are the lifeblood of the American economy, whether you like it or not. And when you pull the plug on fossil fuels like Biden's done, you're going to have a downstream inflation impact. And we're seeing that. And I just think it's going to get worse and worse the more that his green energy policies possibly come to fruition.
Well, Justin, what do you think about this from just like a messaging perspective? Because I feel like, we can talk all day about what the CPI is, and again, like what the historical CPI has been over the last 20 years, and we could talk about these numbers of, eggs went up 10% and energy prices and all of that, and I feel like your average person's eyes will glaze over. So Chris, you mentioned gas prices. I think gas prices is something that could just cut right through all of the rhetoric, and just people see it every day when they're driving anywhere. They see the prices of gas. But like, I think maybe this Thanksgiving story could also be another thing that cuts through the noise, and the average person will be able to understand what the issue is. What do you think, Justin?
Yeah, I mean, I think illustrating to people the importance of, I think throwing numbers at people is not very helpful unless you can tie it to some sort of real life example. And so I think the holidays are a great case to show people the cost of travel, as Chris said. The cost of buying that turkey is going to be a lot more. The cost of buying Christmas presents is going to be much higher than it was before. But these things have, you got to give people something tangible and real to get them to understand what's going on, because most people don't necessarily understand how inflation works or why it works or any of these things. And I also think it's important to tie this to all of the policies that are being put into place that are supposedly meant to help them, right? Many middle class and lower income people. So on the one hand, the government might be giving you a handout, but on the other hand, they're making life significantly more expensive across the board. And these two things are tied together. And while they're doing that, they're also setting the stage for a possible, economic crisis, because inflation is tied to money printing. Money printing, it puts the entire economy at risk and is creating this gigantic bubble. And so I think you could say to people, look, this is really irresponsible what the government is doing. It's putting the entire economy at risk. Also, that they can give you a little bit of a handout that is going to be offset by everything in your life being more expensive. Just look at the cost of buying Christmas presents this year. Just look at the cost of traveling. Look at the cost of the gasoline that you put in your car. Yeah, they might send you an extra couple $100 a month, but everything in your life is more expensive now because of their policies. And if there's an economic crash from these irresponsible policies, which could happen, then everyone's going to be way, way worse off. Then forget about inflation. Millions of people are going to lose their jobs. We could have a financial crisis. I think you gotta make it. I think it's important to tie real world examples to it, but I think you also have to make it scary, because it is really scary. It's a sign of a really unhealthy situation when you have lots of money printing, lots of government debt, lots of growth in the stock market and things like that, big bubbles that are happening that are not the result of natural economic growth. Then what you're really showing people, or that illustrates, is that there is a crisis that's potentially building here. Right. And inflation is all tied into that. And so it isn't just my gasoline's $1 more per gallon than it was a year ago. I mean, that sucks, and that's a real world example. But I think the bigger, scarier thing is, do you remember the 2008 financial crisis? Do you remember what happened in 2009, 2010, 2011? You remember how bad things were? Well, this is a sign that something like that could happen again really soon.
Yeah, well, when you're reading through this article, the author's very careful to point out that, oh no, this is a multi-variable problem. It's the bad weather. It's these trade policies. It's the supply chain disruption. It's China cutting its back on steel production, et cetera, et cetera. And I don't doubt that all or most of these are resulting in changes in prices and goods, but it seems like, they're not pointing out all of these things to make a clearer, more accurate picture of reality. It feels like they're doing this to obscure the one large overarching issue, which is the current and looming inflation. So let's start off with just how bad is it. So Chris, I've got a piece here, and again, everything I talk about, I always say this, is in the show notes, but I've got a piece here that was published recently, a piece of yours in Townhall, titled "Americans' Economic Confidence Plummets Amid Increasing Inflation and Shortages." So from your perspective, Chris, how bad is inflation looking right now? And maybe give us some of the numbers if you have them on hand.
So we are at 5.4% year-over-year inflation, which is the highest it's been since 2008, if you go into some of the different sectors, especially energy sector, which we've kind of mentioned here, it's through the roof. It's 30%. They've already talked about home heating bills are going to be 50% higher in my state, Illinois. So it's bad. It's getting worse, and like Justin said, inflation tends to like have a snowball effect. It doesn't get better. It gets worse, and I think it's going to get worse for the next year and a half, maybe 2 years.
Yeah, when they say that, like, oh, it's short term, it's like, okay, it's not like prices are going to go back. And maybe, Justin, you already mentioned this, but it's not like prices are going to go back to what they were before a wave of inflation. It just evens out and doesn't continue to increase. So this idea that it's like a short-term thing, like, there is no short-term thing, unless they're suggesting that there's going to be some like round of deflation afterwards. But I don't think anyone is suggesting that. So yeah, it's definitely a compounding problem. But yeah, so core inflation stands at 5.3%. This is just some stats from your article. Over the past year, the price of gasoline is up 43%, natural gas 21%, electricity overall 5.2%. Used car prices have skyrocketed 32% over the last year. It says, when taken into account, the average American household is spending an extra $175 per month on food and energy, thanks to inflation. Justin, you've been keeping an eye on this topic as well. Anything you want to add to their current situation?
Yeah, well, I just want to go back to this idea that this is a transitory problem that is related to issues having to do with the recovery from COVID-19 and that sort of thing, which is what the Biden administration and people like that have been telling us for a while. There's no doubt that that's playing a big role in all of this. There is a supply chain problem that we have in the world. It's related to COVID-19. It's also related to a whole bunch of other things, including the government's policies that have sort of disincentivized people from going back to work and doing other things. There's all kinds of issues in China that are going on right now. Some of them are related to COVID, some are not. That's impacting this supply chain crisis, and that's causing part of the problem. There's no doubt about that. But just remember this, a couple things. One, the same people who are who told us that this was a transitory problem, that it would not last for a very long time, that it would be over by right about now, we're totally and completely wrong. And now they're telling us that it's actually not going to be over until this time next year. Right? So why should we believe anything they have to say about this? And then the other thing is, what's the simplest answer? What's the simplest explanation for why we're seeing this? What's the simplest explanation? Well, it could be aliens. I don't think that's the simplest explanation. It is an explanation, perhaps. But what's the simplest explanation? When they say, well, it's supply chain and it's this and it's that and all that, that might explain some of it, but it doesn't explain all of it. But you know what does? The simplest thing? They've been printing trillions and trillions and trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars, and they've been pumping it into the economy, and those dollars are floating around the economy. And when you have more dollars chasing the same number of goods or services or less, you have inflation. That's just common sense. And so when you look at this, and I want to add this I'm going to try to add this to this is a chart. If you're watching on YouTube, you'll be able to see this. This is the total assets of the Federal Reserve, okay? Over time. It only goes back to just before 2008. Now look at what this shows is when the Federal Reserve is one way that it puts money into the economy is they buy assets, and that is a way for them to put cash into the system, okay?
Yeah, this is the real money printing right here.
This is the real money printing. It's not just government spending, because the Fed can do this without the government actually spending money, all right? Sure. Look at what we're seeing here, okay? You can see at the beginning of 2008, the number is, somewhere around $1 trillion, okay? And you can see in assets, and you can see a giant spike that happens there. This is right around the financial crisis. And it goes up and up and up and up and up during the Obama administration. It keeps going up and up and up and up because this is them printing money and pumping it into the economy.
That's all of the quantitative easing things, right?
That's right. Now, right around 2016, you see it starts to slowly decline, and it goes slowly decline, and it keeps declining. This is the Trump era. This is because the economy is improving, and the Fed is not pumping lots of money into the economy. Then you have 2020, and you have the coronavirus pandemic, and you see it shoot way, way up, and it's continued to go up, and it's still going up. right?
Yeah.
That's because the Fed is still pumping trillions and trillions of dollars into the economy. Now, look at this. In 2008 to 2010, right? This is the financial crisis. This is TARP, all of this stuff, right? There was what, about $1 trillion or so added in to the Fed's balance sheet. Well, compare that to what happened with the coronavirus pandemic, lockdowns, all that stuff. It was about $4 trillion that have been added to the balance sheet, right? So this means that they're pumping trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars more than they did even in the last financial crisis, which was the most amount of money printing they had ever done prior to that point in time.
Right.
So the idea that this is not really causing the problem
Right.
is, to me, totally ludicrous.
Yeah,
of course this is causing. This has to be part of the problem here. There's no way that you can say that we're printing way more money than we've ever printed before, pumping it into the economy. But oh yeah, you know what? This isn't really it. You know what it really is? It's that paint factory in China that shut down, and that's what's causing all of this. No, I mean that's part of it, but this is the bigger issue.
Right. Yeah. So like the quantitative easing in 2008 and the aftermath of the 2008 recession and all of that was like considered by, especially by like economists on our side of the aisle, as this like big experiment. Like what happens when we just print trillions of dollars and pump it into the economy? And you had people on our side saying like, it's probably going to result in inflation and all of that. Fast forward to today and the response to the corona and all of that, it dwarfs. Like if you look at that chart and you have one takeaway, it's that the reaction to what happened with corona and all that from the government dwarfs what we did to kind of get out, quote unquote, of the Great Recession in 2008. So yeah, if you think that this has no real impact on inflation, like that's just insanity.
And just one last thing, just to tie that all up, as the chart illustrates, and I don't know if we could, how do we pull that back up? I don't want Donnie's face on there. There we go. As the chart illustrates, it's still going up.
Right.
It's the pandemic is the crisis is over. Okay. We still have a pandemic. But the lockdowns are done, right? For the most part, the lockdowns are done. Why are the numbers still dramatically going up? Why is this happening? If you just look at 2021 and you just look at the money that they're putting into the economy, pumping into the economy, printing in just 2021, it's basically about as much as they did at the height of the financial crisis back in 2008, 2009.
So Peter Lan in our comments says we didn't get much inflation from the 2008 quantitative easing. So this is actually a thing that people on our side of the aisle have been discussing basically since 2008, because you're right. There's like, where's the inflation from all of this? Where's all of the inflation that people are constantly warning about? And I would argue that we did see some inflation. It's just that the inflation was specifically located within certain industries. So if you look at like the housing prices, and Justin and I have talked about this a lot, the housing prices and how they dropped, during the 2007-8 housing crisis and all of that, all of those prices went like right back up in just a handful of years. And the reason why, because the monetary policy that was crafted by the Fed and by the government injected all of this new money directly into these banks that were holding these mortgages and all of this type of stuff. So it was directly trying to reinflate that bubble that popped in the housing market. So the massive housing prices that we're seeing today, that's the inflation that resulted from 2008. Like that's where it is.
Well, and Donnie, we're also seeing a gigantic stock market bubble because
that's another very good point.
Because a lot of people are parking their money in equity because bonds are not paying out nearly to what, like 1-2%, and savings accounts also. So when the Fed artificially lowers interest rates, it hurts savers, and it artificially forces people to put their money in a more volatile stock market. And that's creating a giant asset bubble. So it's the housing market, it's the stock market.
Exactly.
The stock market is not tethered to the Main Street economy anymore. And I think most people understand this. The stock market is going through the roof, but the mainstream economy, they just released the GDP report. It's growing at a sluggish 2%.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah, well, just one other thing, and I'll throw it to you, Justin. Looks like he's pulling up another chart, but just like, if all of the trillions of dollars that they printed with the quantitative easing, if that wasn't just directly injected into these banks and these, whatever, more to bail out all the mortgage stuff, and instead it was just like helicoptered onto the general population, I think you would see a growth in your general consumer price index. You would see general levels of inflation instead of it just being located in the housing market. And I would argue that we're seeing more of that type of policy, that helicopter dropping of money, in the response to the coronavirus. Right. So the idea that now this time it will result in a general CPI increase, I think, is very likely. Go ahead.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. That's all really important points. If you, as Chris said and as Donnie said, when you look at specific sectors, that's really where you see the inflation shine through. And you can see it here with this chart. Again, if you're watching on YouTube, you'll see this is from the St. Louis Fed, and this is the median sales price of a home. Now look at 2020. That's that gray line there, sort of all the way at the right of the screen. Look at the average cost of a house. Look at what happened after 2020. Now this is in the middle of a pandemic. Millions of jobs lost, and the average cost of a home went from $322,600 in quarter 2 2020, so $322,000, to $404,000 in quarter 3 2021. Now, that is an $80,000 increase in the cost of a home, even though we have millions of fewer jobs than we had at that point in time. Now, how does that make any sense economically? Why would the average cost of a home skyrocket in the midst of a period of time where you have a gigantic economic decline and then a sort of slow-ish recovery? Why would that happen? It's because of inflation. That's why. And why is it in housing and not necessarily in other things? Because much of the money ends up in the hands of banks in particular, and financial institutions. And what they do with the money is they lend it out. Why? To make more money. That's what they do. So when they're lending the money out at really low interest rates, which the Fed has to keep the interest rates low when you have these situations, because the government's taken on so much debt that if they increase the interest rates to realistic levels like 5%, 6%, 7%, which used to be normal, the entire economy and government would go bankrupt essentially. The economy would crash because the government wouldn't be able to pay its bills. So they can't do that. They have to keep interest rates low when they're pumping money into the economy. And when they're pumping money into the economy, keeping interest rates low, it makes it easier to get access to these dollars when you're banking. And because of that, people know when they sell their home, they can charge more money for it. It's a distortion. And that's really the point. That was the point that Chris was making, right? It's full of distortions. The economy is a funhouse mirror distortion of what it should be. And as a result of that, you see these gigantic bubbles formulating all over the economy. So inflation is not necessarily causing the bubble. It's a symptom of these other issues, the money printing and other things. But that was what I was trying to get at earlier, is that I think it's a mistake to look at inflation and just say, well, our lives it's a tax on people and our lives are getting more expensive. And look at how bad inflation is. It's affecting the cost of gasoline. The average cost of a house is $80,000 more. That's way more important than the average cost of gasoline going up by $1. And sure. and the fact that it's creating a housing bubble potentially that could pop, we don't know, is also a huge concern that people should take into account too. So inflation is super important, not just because of the pain it's inflicting on people, but also because of what it signifies.
Right. I've got a few other articles that if you're interested, you could check out in the show notes. Some that just kind of cover some of the stuff that we're talking about here, go into a little bit more depth in some of the numbers that we're seeing around the economy. But I want to move on to just this idea that it seems like there's a concerted effort by many to downplay the specter of inflation. And to illustrate that point, I've got a couple of pieces of evidence. One is, we've already kind of talked about this, which is that concept that inflation is transitory. That it's going to go away. It's just like a very short-term thing because we're turning on all the gears of the economy after we shut it all down because of COVID, and it'll be very short-term inflation. So this was a statement that was made by like the Fed chairman, many people in the Biden administration, and even they have started walking this back a bit, saying that inflation might stick around a little bit longer than we previously thought. I think Justin kind of covered this pretty nicely. More recently, White House Chief of Staff Ronald Klain,
Klein, I think,
retweeted a statement by Harvard economist Jason Furman saying that inflation and the supply chain issues are, quote, high-class problems. So not to take it out of context, I'll read the exact tweet that Robert Klein retweeted. Most of the economic problems we're facing, inflation, supply chains, etc., are high-class problems. We wouldn't have had them if the unemployment rate was still 10%. We would have instead had a much worse problem. So this to me is like, I don't know, your house was flooded, so we lit it on fire to evaporate all the water. So your house being on fire is a high-class problem, considering you don't have to worry about your flooded house anymore. Chris, what do you think about this statement?
It's ridiculous. As we mentioned before, inflation hurts the poor and the middle class by far the hardest. If you're a multimillionaire and the price of eggs or the price of gas is up a little bit, it's not going to have much impact on your everyday life. But if you are an American, especially American on a fixed income, seniors, this is really having an impact on your life. So it's the complete opposite. It's not a high class problem.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, we've talked about it being regressive. Go ahead, Justin.
Yeah, the average cost of, like I said, the average cost of a house, okay, so that's a middle class problem and working class problem, is $80,000 more than it was about a year and a half ago. That's not a high class problem. That's a middle class and working class problem. The average cost of a car is up $1,500. The average cost of a car is now, of a new vehicle, is now $40,000, higher than $40,000. Do you think that that's do lower income people need cars? Do working class people need cars? I think they do. So the average cost of used cars is also through the roof. These things are impacting people. And of course, groceries and things like that. I mean, they are disproportionately hurting lower income people, in fact, because upper income people can afford to pay more. They can afford to take out the debt. They can afford to, buy the more expensive house and pay it off over 30 years. Lower income people might not even be able to buy a house now because maybe the down payment is going to be too much for them to handle because they've been priced out of it, right? So the idea that this is an upper income problem and not a problem that affects lower income people is I would say it's delusional. Except I know that these people understand that. And so really what it is it's just lying. It's a political lie because they can't come out and say, who's hurt most by our policies? Poor people. They're the ones who are hurt the most. They can't say that. So instead they're going to say it hurts rich people because no one gives a damn about them. And that's political posturing. That's all this is, but it's completely dishonest at the very least. Well,
so I want to I want to make sure that we're interpreting this correctly. I don't want to take his whatever out of context. So what I think he's trying to say is you're lucky that we're dealing with the inflation problem because the 10% unemployment problem, that was a much worse thing that we were able to circumvent, right? I think that's the point that he's trying to make. And to me, it just seems, I think it was referred to as tone deaf. Justin, looks like you want to jump in.
Well, what I guess what I don't understand is he saying that the inflation problem is partially the inflation problem is the trade-off for having better employment. That's what it sounds like.
That's right? What I was thinking at first, which that seems kind of crazy to me too. But at the very least, it's just a tone deaf thing to dismiss inflation as well, yeah, we dealt with your house being flooded or whatever. So just deal with the fire. It's just no, the fire is also something we have to pay attention to. What the heck, man?
Yeah, go ahead, Chris.
Well, I was just going to say that Pete Buttigieg, he had the same sort of talking points where he said hey, store shelves are empty and prices are going up because people are buying so much stuff. That's not true.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's the economy is so good that there's inflation. That's what it is. We're so good.
It's just like, at the very least, inflation is a problem that also needs to be addressed. So Jen Psaki was asked about this, this idea of the downplaying of inflation during a press conference. So we have a video of that. Let's play good old Jen Psaki. Am I pronouncing her name right?
White House Chief Ron Klain retweeted a message yesterday, not once but twice, that inflation and supply chain issues are high-class issues. But some of the sharpest price increases over the last month included products that every American buys: beef products, chicken, eggs, regular unleaded gasoline, laundry equipment, furniture, clothing. The list goes on. Why would Ron Klain tweet that? And would you agree that that's a little bit tone deaf?
Do you think 2 tweets means more? I'm just curious. So just for context,
God. Can you just pause it right there?
What Ron Klain retweeted?
Her little flippant remark, like, "Oh, do you think him retweeting it twice makes a big difference?" Like, who are you? Are you just like this elite on the hill talking to all the plebes? Like, how dare you ask me a question type of thing? Can't stand it. But sorry, go ahead. Let's play the rest of the video. There we go.
Was a tweet from the former chairman of economic advisors, Jason Furman, where he said, for full context, which I think is important, most of the economic problems we're facing, inflation, supply chains, are high-class problems. When he went on to say is, we wouldn't have had them if unemployment rate was still 10%. We would instead have had a much worse problem. So I think the point here is, well, there are some critics who are saying what some of these critics are saying we don't know if they're saying that what they thought was great was when the unemployment rate was double what it is today, or when people were locked in their homes and therefore gas prices were lower. We're at this point because the unemployment rate has come down and been cut in half because people are buying more goods, because people are traveling, and because demand is up. And because the economy is turning back on. So Jason Furman, of course, is more than capable of speaking or tweeting for himself, obviously, and providing any additional context. What the point is here is that
it does seem like that's the talking point, Chris. I think you nailed it. The talking point is, well, inflation is just the result of the gears turning back on and people buying stuff. Like that's clearly the marching orders talking points from the administration.
The argument. The argument is you guys should just be grateful that we have more jobs. And really, frankly, the fact that we have more jobs than we had a year ago is the reason why we have the inflation, because we added all these jobs and the economy turning back on, and now we've got all this inflation. But what makes no sense is the inflation is outpacing the job growth. We have fewer jobs, actually, than what we had 2 years ago. So we should not have this level of inflation if it's just the jobs turning back on. That doesn't make any sense. Why would we have tons of inflation, historic levels of inflation, while having millions of fewer jobs than we had 2 years ago if the jobs coming back is the reason for the inflation? That doesn't make any sense. If that's the case, then why weren't we seeing these same levels of inflation 2 years ago? I mean, when we had more jobs than we have now. So under Trump, we had more jobs, but inflation was less. But under Biden, we have fewer jobs than we had under Trump, but inflation is way more. But it's the jobs coming back that's the problem. That is literally the dumbest thing I've ever heard. Not only that, but she claimed in the same thing, she tried to suggest that the critics are criticizing the White House because Klain said that that had something to do with the unemployment. She made it seem like that we would be happier if unemployment was double what it is now, or something like that. Like that somehow critics were suggesting that they were confusing his comments and thinking that he was saying that the unemployment. I mean, it has nothing to do with that. The point is clearly, it could not have been spelled out better by the person asking the question, actually. The point is, don't you think that it's a little tone deaf for you to say that this is a rich person's problem or an upper class person's problem when milk is more expensive and gasoline is more expensive and housing is more expensive and on and on and on. And she, as you said, was, pretty rude, really, when you think about it, and very flippant.
Right.
And then totally gave an answer that didn't make any sense. And
does it sound like somebody that seems even remotely concerned about inflation and what that means for your average person? Like, absolutely not. It was completely dismissive of it. And I got one more piece, and this is not a government official by any means, but I think it kind of shows just like how these messages go through kind of just the general media. So even The View got into this talk about inflation in a segment, and I won't torture you all by playing it. They were discussing a report suggesting that independents are more concerned about inflation and the economy and not about climate change or some other left-wing stuff. And one of the panelists, claiming that she was an independent, said that she was more interested in the government addressing things like inflation and like the left and the right coming together. To which another panelist, responding to her, said, well, that sounds very Republican. So it's like the concept of inflation and being worried about it is just some Republican talking point. Like, this is the message that's being delivered out there by your mainstream media from the government administration, from the Jen Psakis of the world speaking on behalf of the White House, down to the ladies on The View talking at 10 o'clock in the morning or whatever it is. So, I mean, I've seen op-eds talking about inflation's not necessarily bad and all of the things that we just talked about. So why do you think this is? Why do you think there is such an effort to largely ignore this issue of inflation? What do you think, Chris?
I think the media, is willing to do anything to preserve, the Biden presidency. And just this morning, the media was, up in arms, just, so happy that apparently they've come together on some sort of a framework for this multi-trillion spending bill. So not only will that add more to the inflation nightmare that we're already experiencing, but it just goes to show. I mean, and Donnie, I think everyone knows this. The media is corrupt. They are obviously, trying to, help the Biden administration any way they can. So, I mean, I'm not surprised.
Well, okay, so I think that's kind of like a very, I don't know, that's like an answer to my question that I would much expect, right? It's just like, this is the administration trying to protect itself. It's the media trying to protect the administration. But like, Justin, don't you think that's just really short-term thinking, even by government standards? Like, if they ignore and downplay inflation and it ends up being far worse than they said, and it's already worse than they were originally saying, but won't that bode terribly for them come election time?
No. No, I mean, look, the plan is you lie your way to election day and then you hope that nobody notices. That's the plan.
Yeah.
I mean, there is no other way around it, right? You just lie. You keep putting out the same talking point and you hope that everybody just runs with it. And the media often does run with it. They often do get away with this sort of thing. And so this is the playbook that they've been using for a very long time. They're going to do it with inflation. They did it with Afghanistan. They do it with scandals related to Hillary Clinton. They did it with scandals related to Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, whatever. I mean, they Benghazi, right? Like, the idea is you lie as much as you possibly can to get to election day, and then you let the chips fall where they may, right? That's the plan. So
yeah, and then blame all of the problems on the previous administration.
Well, I mean, yeah, exactly. I mean, if you can, you blame it on the previous administration, but in a lot of cases, they just ignore. They pretend like it isn't even a problem, which is what they're doing here. Yeah. It's not like they're saying, "Oh, this is all Donald Trump's fault." No, they're actually taking credit for it. But they're saying it's the unattended consequence or the unfortunate consequence of all their great policies creating all these jobs.
Right.
So like it's actually proof of how great things are. That's what they're trying to argue.
But the messaging will change. I mean, remember when they were trying to say that Republicans were the ones trying to defund the police? It's like, wait, what? So,
right, exactly. And if you're and let's just stop for a second and let that absorb. Let that absorb into people's minds. If you are willing to try to shift the blame on defund the police to Republicans, then you are willing to lie about literally anything. Because that was so ludicrous, and yet they still tried it. They will try anything.
Yeah, no doubt, no doubt. So, what happens next? I think is the next logical point for this conversation. It appears as though that we are getting some gloomy predictions. The first one I have is from one of my least favorite people, Jack Dorsey from Twitter. I don't know if I haven't talked about either of you to either of you about this, but late last week, Jack tweeted, "Hyperinflation is going to change everything. It's happening." And then he followed up that tweet by saying, "It will happen in the U.S. soon, and so the world." Justin, you probably dislike Jack as much as I do. What are your thoughts on this?
I think it
First off, did you hear about this? Did you hear about this?
I did, yes. So the context of it somewhat is Jack Dorsey is a big fan of cryptocurrencies, and that's part of all of this, okay? He's a big believer in crypto. He believes in alternative money systems. He doesn't like the Federal Reserve and the things that it's doing. And so that's part of all of it, I'm sure. I have no doubt about it whatsoever. But with all that said, I think it's actually really hard to tell what is going to happen as far as inflation and things like that, because it really does depend on what the Federal Reserve and other central banks around the world do. It is very much in their hands. I mean, if the Federal Reserve, I'm not saying the Fed should do this, but if the Fed came out tomorrow and said, you know what, we're going to raise interest rates to 10%, there would not be inflation.
Sure.
So theoretically, they could do that. Now, it would crush the economy, and there'd be a collapse, an economic collapse, and they know that, and they're not going to do it. But my point is, they really do have total control over whether we have runaway inflation or not. So when you say, what's going to happen with inflation? It's like, well, what is the Fed going to do? And I don't know if anyone can really answer that, because it's so speculative. They know at the Fed that they're causing inflation. I'm convinced of that. They know that they have to scale this back somehow. They know that. But they also know that whatever they do can't be so dramatic that it's going to cause a financial catastrophe, an economic crash, a stock market crash. And pretty much any solution will do that. Solution. So what they need to do is have a very slow unwinding that occurs over a very long period of time, where they very slowly raise interest rates, very slowly cut back on all of the other programs that they're doing to pump money into the economy. But they won't do that because there will be some other crisis that occurs between now and that period of time where it causes them to print more money very rapidly, right?
Sure.
So I don't know how this all ends. Probably in catastrophe.
So you might be thinking like, well, what does Jack Dorsey know about macroeconomics? You pointed out that he's super interested in cryptocurrencies. You might be thinking, Jack Dorsey, isn't he the guy that's looking more and more like a cult leader? Like, yes, that's all very true things. He's not the most stable person, at least from the looks of him. So to those sentiments, I'm very sympathetic. But here's a warning that might be a little bit more credible. So this is an article, Business Insider. Blackstone CEO predicts the energy crisis will worsen inflation and prompt social unrest. So Steven Schwartzman, CEO of asset management company Blackstone, recently said that rising energy prices were going to get worse and lead to, quote, very unhappy people around the world. Echoing that statement, we got Larry Fink, the CEO of BlackRock, the world's largest asset manager, who said, inflation, we are in a new regime. There are many structural reasons for that. Short-term policy related on environmentalism in terms of restricting supply of hydrocarbons has created energy inflation, and we are going to be living with that for some time. So it seems like there are a number of warnings, even people outside of the right of center, media voices and all of that. So what are the solutions to this problem? Justin, you mentioned the potential of the Fed raising interest rates to curb inflation. That's historically what they're supposed to do. But we are well in the realm of modern monetary theory, in my opinion, now. So what is the modern monetary theory solution to inflation? Well, the knee-jerk one, the simple solution to it is raising taxes. So, Chris, you mentioned the framework of this new $1 trillion spending deal. I assume it's not much different than the ones that we've talked about in the past on this podcast, but included in those past versions that we've talked about it is a number of tax increases. So I'm wondering if that is why Joe Biden said that if he were able to pass all the things on his agenda, we would actually see reduced inflation, he said in a dementia-ridden fog. So I'm wondering if that's the real kind of hidden strategy here for them. We can cut inflation by raising taxes according to the dogma of modern monetary theory. What do you think about that, Chris?
I mean, I don't buy it. I look back at the 1970s stagflation and what we had to do to get out of that. And for the first 2 years of Ronald Reagan's term, he worked with the Federal Reserve, and the Federal Reserve did what they had to do, and it caused some short-term pain. But look what happened, after the 2 years of that short-term pain. We had 6 years of a booming economy. So I'm concerned that the Federal Reserve under Jerome Powell does not have the courage to say, you know what, we need to just take our medicine. It is going to be rough. It is going to be hard, but this is the only way to squeeze inflation out of the economy. And I'm just concerned that the American people and our leaders do not have the stamina or the backbone to do what needs to be done. So I think they're just going to keep trying to do, like Justin said, short term. And all that's going to do is just make this worse.
Jess, I'm going to give you the last word on all this because we're running out of time, but I am going to just kind of echo what Chris said. The solutions, the real solutions to this are not easy. We need to stop the money printing. We need to cut spending. We have to allow interest rates to increase. None of these things are going to be pleasant, but unfortunately, we have to abide by fundamental economic laws that we haven't been abiding by for a long time now. And the hidden tax of inflation is the cost that we're going to have to pay for that. So we have to stop all of this and realign ourselves with basic economic principles. Justin, last words.
Yeah, I think that's true. But realistically, that's not only, realistically that there's literally 0% chance of this happening. They're not going to do that. And the thing is, even if they did do it and they said, you know what, we're going to have to raise interest rates and that's going to have to bring us back down to earth, they wouldn't raise interest rates enough to unwind all of the chaos that they've already unleashed. Like it's not going to be enough. And they actually have created a crisis so big that I don't know that they can fix it using their traditional way of fixing it unless they really committed themselves to it over a 10, 15, 20 year period of time.
Sure.
And that's not possible politically because over the next 10, 15, 20 years, something will happen that will cause everyone to say, we got to throw the rule book out and we got to print a bunch of money. That will inevitably happen. So they've created a crisis they can't solve quickly, and they have a political reality, a system that will make it impossible because of the way that many people on the left think, make it impossible for us to solve this over the long term. And I think they know both of these things. That they can't fix it in the long term by increasing interest rates high enough to solve it quickly because it will cause a crash and they can't do that. And they know they can't fix it over the long term because over the long term, some other crisis will come up that will force them to deviate from this plan in the long term. So what is the real solution in their minds? I think they're going to switch the currencies. That's what I think. I think the dollar is dead. I think they know the dollar is dead. They know that they've put themselves in a hole. They can't get out of it. They know they're screwed, and they're going to switch to a digital currency. That's what I think is going to happen. And they're already running test cases for it. The Fed is already floating the idea internally and talking to academics about how they would do this. They've got pilot programs and things like that. I do believe eventually we're going to have a transition to a digital dollar. Everyone will just think it's just a digital version of the existing dollar because they won't understand that it's actually a separate currency entirely. And I think that that's their way out. It's their way of avoiding all of these problems. And the other thing to keep in mind, it's something we haven't talked about, but it is really important and it is looming over all of these conversations having to do with the devaluation of the dollar and printing money and raising interest rates and all of that, is that unlike many other countries that control their own currency, like Japan and like the European Union, which isn't a country, but they control their own currency. Unlike all of those places, The dollar is the world reserve currency. That means that all over the world, they use the dollar for international transactions, especially when it comes to things like energy and things like that, right? So if we continue to devalue the dollar, or even if we continue to do anything that makes the dollar look like it's unstable, then the world is going to switch away from that dollar, use of the dollar for the world reserve currency, to something else. They want to do it. There's lots of international institutions that have been calling for this for a long, long time. People in Europe have been wanting this for a long time. The International Monetary Fund has been wanting this for a long time. And why does that matter? Why should we care about that? Because if that actually happens, we will have a depression here. We'll have an economic depression, because the business class here will understand what that signifies. It will mean that the United States is not the most powerful economy anymore. Dollars will flood into the United States, causing more inflation to happen because there's nowhere else to use those dollars. They have to bring them back into the United States to use them. It's going to create a financial crisis. And ultimately, we're all going to be much, much worse off because of that. The best thing that we could do over the long run is to have a stable, strong currency that is, and the only way to have that is to have real interest rates that are based on markets, not based on socialist policies and pipe dreams and modern monetary theory and things like that, and to be responsible with our currency. That is not going to happen unless, this is the only way, and it probably won't happen, but this is literally the only way to save the dollar as it currently stands, a balanced budget amendment. That's it. If we had a balanced budget amendment or some kind of amendment that made it so that capped the amount of spending you could have, that would force the government into a sound fiscal track monetarily, then we have a shot. We have a chance. But it would have to be a balanced budget amendment that doesn't just control the government, it also controls the Federal Reserve. And I don't see that happening. So I do believe we're going to have a crash at some point in the next 10 to 15 years.
To end this on a very positive note there, Justin. I will say we are out of time, but I will say that just to kind of pitch stuff that Heartland is doing right now, if you're interested in all the energy stuff that we have talked about, all the climate change stuff that we talk about on this podcast routinely, there is the COP26 meeting that's going to be happening in Scotland, and Heartland is sending a little delegation over there to Scotland. That's why Jim is not here on the episode today. They're getting all ready for that. So if you're interested, you could see the whole live stream of that conference or counter conference on our YouTube channel, or you could just probably go to heartland.org and find a link to it. But that's going to do it for today. Thank you all for tuning into this episode of In the Tank podcast. If you're watching the show, or if you're listening to the show, that means you're probably listening on a Friday. You could join us a day early on Thursday to watch it live on YouTube and Facebook. You can participate, get in the private chat, send us some messages and some questions. We'll respond to you and the like, if it's appropriate. If you like our show, please subscribe, rate, or review for us on iTunes. It'd be greatly appreciated. And if you would like, you can follow us on Socialist Twitter at In the Tank Pod. If you have any questions, suggestions, or anything like that, feel free to email us at inthetankpodcast@gmail.com. Justin, where can the fine people find you?
At Justin T. Haskins on Facebook, Socialist Twitter, Parler, Getter, or whatever we're supposed to call that thing, and just about everywhere else on the internet. Oh, YouTube. You're going to plug our show, our new show that's coming out soon?
What's
the deal with that? No, you should plug it. You should plug it.
We have a new show coming out. It's not out yet, but it's called Justin and Donald Save America. We're getting an episode or two in the can so we could release with a few episodes, but that's also something that you should check out if you want more of Justin's face.
What?
Okay. Chris, you are a ghost on social media, so just join me in saying goodbye to the fine people.
Well, Donnie, real quick, speaking of ghosts, I mean, in the Halloween spirit, I kind of feel like you're have a very ghostly presence here. So
oh, nice. Yeah, that's good. That's a good point. That's a very good point. All right, thank you all for tuning in. We will talk to you next week.